tonight. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, but the book, the Warren Wiersbe's book, Be Satisfied, that was going to be chapter 3. And so any comments that he would be making or anything that I would quote would be in chapter 3 of his book. Last week we started with chapter 1 in Ecclesiastes, and one of the things that I commented on and try to encourage us all to do is understanding that when we are reading the Old Testament, that we're going to be reading it through the eyes of the New Testament. Solomon doesn't have all the information. Another thing about Solomon is that he did fall during his life, and he made God angry with the sins that he brought into Israel, the idol worship. He himself bowed down to other gods. We believe and hope that he was restored, and maybe Ecclesiastes came at a time around that restoration, don't know. But he is writing from a standpoint of a guy who had fallen. And many of the lessons that he learned was, that disconnect. But once again, they did not have all the information. They didn't have all the knowledge of what you and I enjoy in the new covenant. And I said last week, Jesus is the cheat code. He's the center of everything. He's the one that brings the meaning. He's the one that gives the purpose in life. So just kind of last week, Solomon hinted at nothing crooked can be made straight, and there's nothing new under the sun. But in the Bible, in Isaiah, it says the crooked shall be made straight. And God said several times through the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, I do a new thing." So with God, nothing's impossible. And so understanding, once again, Solomon did not have all the information. And so a lot of that book of Ecclesiastes sometimes can be viewed as a very negative book. And that's one of the questions that Warren Wiersbe asked in his book. Do you see this book as negative? No, not if you take it in context. If you take it in context. Without Christ, I would say that there's not a lot of purpose. Without Christ being on the wrong side of God, I can understand because I spent a lot of time on the wrong side of God as out in my youth, and just the despair in life. But with Jesus Christ, things make sense. So you'll see on your notes tonight anything you want to add or anything you want to under each one of those headings, feel free to do or add. I really didn't want to get too complicated with it, that you can take the notes that mean something to you. But you'll see tonight there's 4 main points that Solomon brings up in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. One is the futility of seeking after pleasure. And a vanity of vanities, the word vanity is more about futility than what we would say today as selfishness and arrogance. It's more about just grasping for the wind, he said. So the futility of even accomplishment or success, you could use that word. Even the futility of labor, hard work, of just working, the futility in that. And then finally, he has the call for contentment. Over and over in the book of Ecclesiastes, we're pulled into Solomon's and really mankind's, I'll use this word, existential crisis. This existentialism is the belief and the philosophy that is up to the individual to determine purpose and meaning in your life. It's up to you to do that. And so it's oftentimes thought of as an atheistic viewpoint. And Solomon wouldn't have used that term, but that's what he's doing. He's looking at these crises that have come up because of his actions. We read it, I set myself to do this. I asked the question, is there any prophet under the sun? And with that statement, under the sun, Warren Wiersbe points out that Solomon is looking for meaning down here alone. The meaning is here and nothing else. It's not an eternal search. It's not is there any meaning and is there any purpose down here? And that's the question. And so tonight we're continuing on his discovery and on his journey, asking the question, what's this for? And Ecclesiastes is a book that makes us ask hard questions about the meaning of life. And so I'm going to read the verses of chapter 2, if you want to join with me. I'll try to keep this microphone at a safe distance here so I won't get too loud. So remember the question he had last week is, what profit is it for man and all of his labors under the sun? So here we go, chapter 2. He says, I said in my heart, come and I will test you with selfish pleasures to experience desires. And notice that this too is vanity. And I said of frivolous fun, there are only senseless ideas regarding selfish pleasure. What purpose is this? I investigated how to cheer up my body with wine while my heart was still guiding me with wisdom in order to grasp folly until I might experience what is good for sons of men to do under heaven during the number of the days that they might have. Verse 4, I accomplished great works. I built houses for myself and planted myself vineyards. I made for myself royal gardens and parks. I planted in them all sorts of fruit trees. I made for myself pools of water to irrigate the forest of growing trees. I even bought male and female slaves, even some were born to me in my house. And I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and treasures of kings and provinces. I obtained singers, both men and women, and the delights of the sons of men, and many concubines. So I became great and surpassed anyone who had been in Jerusalem before me. All the while, my wisdom remained with me. And everything that my eyes wanted, I did not refuse them. And I did not withhold my heart from any selfish pleasure, for my heart was glad from all my efforts. And this was my reward for all my efforts. Then I turned to all the work that my hands had designed, and all the labor that I had toiled to make and notice, and all of it was vanity and chasing the wind. And there was no benefit under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom, the folly of ideas and foolish behavior. For what else can a man do who comes after the king? Or what more than those who have already done? Then I saw there is more benefit in wisdom than in foolishness, more benefit in light than in darkness. A wise man has eyes in his head, so he sees where he walks, but the fool continues in darkness. Yet I perceive that the same fate overtakes them all. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. He's talking about death. So to what advantage is my wisdom? Then I said to myself, this also is vanity. For there is no lasting memory for the wise or the fool, by which in the coming days everyone will be forgotten. And I began to hate life, for the labor that was done under the sun was contemptible to me. For all of this was vanity and chasing the wind, and I despised all the toil in which I labored under the sun, which I will give up to the man who comes after me. And who knows if this man will be wise or a fool, yet he will gain power over every labor that I have toiled, and my use of wisdom under the sun. Also this is vanity. So I turned to give my heart up to despair concerning all the toil of my labors under the sun. For there is a man who labors with wisdom and knowledge and skill, yet to a man who did not labor for this, he leaves it as his inheritance. This also is vanity and great distress. For what becomes of a man with all his labor and with the striving in his heart that he toils under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work is vexation. Even at night his heart finds no rest, and this is fleeting. There is nothing better for a man to eat and drink and find enjoyment in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God, for who can even eat or have enjoyment more so than I? For to a man who is pleasing before God, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. But the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting to give him who is pleasing before God. Also this is vanity and the chasing the wind. Okay, so within these four thoughts tonight, before we get to them, I want to go back to verse 17 and what Solomon said. He said, I begin to hate life, for the labor that was done under the sun was contemptible to me. For all this was vanity and chasing the wind. he gets fixated on death a lot. And the strange things to me about this concept of him becoming upset and hating life, well, he hates death too. So you see this fear or this wrestling with this idea of death. And we have an answer for that, of course. As I said, Jesus will have the answer. We'll look at that when we end tonight. But when I was a sinner, before I came to Christ, having grown up in the church, having grown up and been raised in church, back in between 16 to 26, I was really deep into the world. When I went to college, I got really smart when I went to college and knew all this stuff. But I'm not, nowhere am I the brains of Solomon. But what happened to him happened to me. And I think Solomon's depressed. I don't know if you can hear it in the writing. He seems like a depressed man. Today, he would be medicated pretty heavily. He was depressed. And that happened to me. And guess what my fixation was? At the end of this long life is death. And there was a season in my life when depression hit me because I had become pulled into that nihilism, however you want to say it, that what does it matter? You know? What does it matter? So that's my thinking went there. And so I understand his depression because I went through that several times in my life. And a lot of it was based upon my own behavior, my own falling out with the Lord and walking out of the kingdom and just my heart in the wrong place. And so he's in this situation where a lot of these problems he has inherited are because of his own actions, Jesus does not guarantee us a trouble-free life just because we follow him. He doesn't promise us that because we're following him that we're never going to get sick and we're never going to have to pray and we're never going to have bad days and everything's going to always make sense. That's not the promise. But what he does promise us is that he will be in the boat with us and will never leave us nor forsake us. And he's actually the strength that we lean on in these times when life is hard and it doesn't make sense. But Solomon is chasing a rabbit down a very deep hole. And the hole he has dug himself. He had gotten that bad. Go back and read in the book of Kings and Chronicles about how angry God was with Solomon because of his sins and the things he did. And we see tonight, he said, I did not prevent my eyes from what they wanted. I did not try to fight off the lust of my eyes or the lust of his flesh or even the pride of life. None of those things did he try to fight. And so these questions that he's asking, or these things he's dealing with tonight, are really things that he has led himself into. My father passed away in 2019. Cancer, he was 79. And my mother's one of 12. And 3 of my mother's family still alive. My mother, a sister younger than her, and an older sister. That older aunt, her name is, I ain't gonna say her name because this is online. So anyway, I better not say that. Oh, by the way, Eddie wanted me to remind you that this is online. So if you want to go back, if you didn't see it last week, you can go back and view it. And the new one will be out next Monday. So he just wanted to remind you of that. But anyway, she was her husband was an atheist. And even he died an atheist. He never came to faith that I know of, unless he did on his deathbed. And because I was a pastor when my uncle, one of my mother's brothers, passed away, they asked me to preach his funeral, and I did. And 2 of my cousins were musicians in the Midwest, and they were famous in the Midwest, and they were killed in a truck wreck, and they asked me, would you come and speak at these funerals? So I spoke at 2 of my funerals, and my uncle was there. And, he was cordial, but he would say very blasphemous things about the faith, But, he was respectful during those days, but it never chipped away at his heart. When my father was passing away and he was facing death, Some of us begin to encourage, one another. We need to let him go because this is very bad, and he's getting weaker and weaker, and this is how God's taking him home. And my dad was so ready. He was not running from it. He was ready. His heart was ready, his soul was, and he was just tired of that fight. Well, my mother gets a call one night from my aunt in panic. And she said, Darlene, when Pete passed away, was he afraid? And she said, oh, no. Said he fought a lot harder for us than, he would have just, he would have just gone very quietly and bravely. Said, no, he wasn't afraid at all. He was ready. She said, well, so-and-so he's petrified. He's terrified. And we see that in Solomon's word. He says the same thing happens to the rich, to the poor, to the fool, to the wise. We all die. I tell my children there is a 100% death rate in America. Everybody's going to be ready. Be ready when it's your time. Make sure you're ready. Make your calling and election sure. We don't know the hour or the day. Not to live in fear other than the fear of God. That's the fear. Other than the fear of God, facing God on the wrong side. But there is something that Solomon didn't know that you and I know, and we're going to remind ourselves of that tonight before we leave. But we see this fear, this nihilism, this what is this for if in the end all you do is die, And that's a trick, that's a bait of Satan, because that kept me depressed and bound for years. Because it makes nothing matter. And Solomon is telling us tonight, this don't matter because you're going to die. Yeah, but you might live to be 110. And look at all the good you can do in your life. But he doesn't see that. Sin is an enemy, not just of God and your relationship with God, but it's your enemy. Because sin robs you of your joy. Sin robs you of your peace. Sin can rob you of your purpose. Solomon talked about his wisdom. It is an interesting thing, and we have to be careful as Christians. If we're not careful, your gift is also your curse. How you use it. And if you don't use it the right way, that gift God gave you, you can turn into a curse. And there were some times in Solomon's life, his wisdom was his curse. One, he didn't follow it. Just read what he did. I gave my heart to wine. I want to see how joyous wine is going to make me feel. I'm still going to be wise, In other words, he's saying, I didn't pass out, but I was pretty drunk. And I'm going to see how wine's going to make me feel. And I'm just going to, all these concubines, I had all these women. Anything I wanted, I got. Well, that's sinful, And if there was ever a human being who could have got whatever he wanted, it was him. And so the word of warning is that playing with sin and yielding to sin is one of the great reasons he had this attitude in this book and these questions. Now, I hope he came back to the Lord, and I think he did. I think writing this was part of that. But that journey, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I think of my decade out into the world, when I was really out in the world. It was in my dark ages, and I wouldn't go back there for $1 billion. If they say, Michael, you walk through those 10 years again, and I'll give you $1 billion, I'll say, you keep your money. It just wasn't worth it. It just wasn't worth it. So let's look tonight. The first thing he talks about is the futility of seeking pleasure. The extreme version of this is hedonism. I'm going to reread a few of those verses. He said, I said in my heart, come and I will test you with selfish pleasures to experience desires. And notice this too is vanity. And I said, a frivolous fun. There's only senseless ideas. And regarding selfish pleasures, what purpose is this? I investigated how to cheer up my body with wine while my heart was still guiding me with wisdom in order to grasp folly until I might experience what is good for the sons of men to do under heaven during the number of the days that they might have life. Anything in and of itself, apart from God, you're not going to find a lot of purpose in it. Now, the Bible tells us that at the right hand of God there are pleasures forevermore. But Solomon wasn't looking for godly pleasures and the pleasure of peace and the pleasure of the enraptured presence of God, or the pleasure of, I don't know, I've experienced it sometimes in my life, being in a church service mostly. There's been a few times I've been alone and had it happen, but most of the time I've been in a church service. I think that's what God's way of telling us we need one another. But there have been times where I was just in such a presence of the Lord and such joy I didn't want it to ever end. And it's happened to me a few times by myself. My trip to Israel when I was a new believer, a young believer, it happened. It's happened in my car a few times, and it's happened, a few times in independent worship. But most of the time I've been in a church service where it was just like, man, this is just a glimpse of what heaven must feel like, that pleasure. So the pleasures Solomon's talking about are the worldly pleasures. One of the questions that Wiersbe asked in his book is, do Christians and non-Christians have the same definition of pleasure? Anybody wanting to tackle that one? Probably not. We think of, when I grew up, all my heroes were Bible characters. And so when we really read the scriptures and we read about their failures and we read about the bad stuff like David's affair and Solomon's sins, and either we gloss over it and we don't really think about it, but this is the great king. He was the golden age. His father left him a united kingdom. And Solomon at the beginning, he had all of the tribes. It was the largest the kingdom ever was. He was wealthy beyond belief. And guess what? Even with all that wisdom, he couldn't handle it. I think Joanne said last week that, he was too smart for his own good. It was just, he couldn't manage it. His wisdom became his curse, because he sat down. And I think something happened in him because he lived in Jerusalem. He lived near the temple. He lived near the presence of God. They didn't have the Spirit dwelling in them like you and I would have because of the covenant. But yet he had seen the glory of God. And then he began to drift away and search these things. And a lot of these questions he wouldn't have asked in a saved state. Because I can tell you as a believer now, that question isn't like it was when I was an atheist, because I used to think I was. In those dark times of what's this for, philosophy and all that stuff. Our minds don't work the same way. So the pleasure of the Christian and the pleasure of the non-Christian are two different things. But even for us, anything in the wrong place can be bad. Anything in the wrong spot. I'm going to say something, probably get in trouble. But I've known men who worship their ministry. I've known men who it was almost, and forgive me, I can't see in somebody's heart, but we're human beings and we think about these things. I thought, well, are you doing that for God or for you? Is that really for the Lord, or is that for you? And God's called us to himself. That's the main calling. And whatever your gifting is and however he wants to use you, it's up to him to do it. But he's called us to himself. And sometimes we put the horse in front of the cart, or get the cart in front of the horse, and we get everything out of whack. And Solomon, tonight, these things he's searching for and asking, is this good? Will this answer my question? Will this give me meaning? And he finds out quickly that pleasure in and of itself is like everything else. It's vain. It's futile. Just pleasure for the sake of pleasure, That's vain. What would be a definition of pleasure? In either side, getting into, for him, he's thinking of wine, women, song. He listed every one. I gave my heart to wine. I had concubines. I hired singers. He was a rock star. He really was. And so that pleasure, what is a good definition of pleasure? Does somebody want to give me one? A godly one or whatever?
Something that makes you feel good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Increases your, for me, something pleasure increases my joy.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I'm a biography junkie. I love watching biographies, and I love reading biographies. The only books I've ever read were stuff that I was told to read at school. I'm sorry, I'm a teacher, but that's the truth. Stuff I was told to read at school, biographies, Lord of the Rings trilogies, Bible, but I like biographies. And some of the biographies I read were Jim Morrison and Stevie Ray Vaughan and people like that. Well, a lot of those I read when I was in college and out in the world. And it was just sad. It was sad how self-destructive, searching and asking the same questions that Solomon asked, but never finding a truth. We have the answer, and tonight we're going to look right into the cheat code, but looking into this place of pleasure for meaning, for purpose, that in and of itself, there is no answer to it. It should be a part of our life. It shouldn't be our life. And this guy is looking for what's the profit under the sun. So let's try pleasure. No, it didn't work. What's the opposite of pleasure? Struggle. The word I chose was pain. And you know, one thing in my life, I have a pretty high pain tolerance to be a male, you know, to be a male, I do have a pretty high pain tolerance. I don't know why, but it's pretty high. And, but physical pain doesn't bother me. I don't take medicine, you know. If I get a headache, which I rarely do, if I get any body aches, I just deal with it. I just don't take a lot of medicine. I don't want a lot of medicine. But emotional pain, the pain of a divorce, the pain of seeing your children stumble, the pain of failures in life, those pains hurt way worse than even I've broken my collarbone 3 times. Yes, sir.
Frustration was right hand in hand with the pain, because the pain brings frustration. So let that much more feel.
Yes, sir. But we're going against pleasure, you know. And C.S. Lewis wrote a book, The Problem of Pain. And so in this world, we look for pleasure to try to counterbalance that pain. And that's why oftentimes these sins that we can find ourselves in happen. We're trying to deal with something here. And Solomon, his pain is caused by his sin. And he goes after it with pleasure. Is this a profit? Is this a way for meaning? Does pleasure give me meaning? There's a lot of wicked people that's their search in life. Their life is hedonism. That's what they believe life's all about. Solomon could do whatever he wanted to do, and he did whatever he wanted to do, and he said that in and of itself is vain. And I agree, that in and of itself is vain. The second thing here is he talks about the futility of great accomplishments or worldly success. He says, I'll read verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. He says, I accomplished great works. I built houses for myself and planted myself vineyards. I made for myself royal gardens and parks, and I planted in them all sorts of fruit trees. Best fruit I've ever had has been in Israel by far. Best melons, best everything, figs, you name it. I made for myself pools of water to irrigate the forests of growing trees. I even bought male and female slaves. Even some were born to me in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been in Jerusalem before me. If you're wondering the version I'm reading the MEV. Another question Wearsby asked, what is success? Ask you this question, could someone say, look at you, I don't know who you are, well I do, but you know what I mean. Someone look at you and go, that's a successful person. And they go, that's a successful person, and you not agree with them. You know? What's success? accomplishments. He named his, built houses, vineyards, pools. I made civil improvements to my country. I had hers. I had anything. I had a lot of wealth. And oftentimes, that's how we do measure it. That's oftentimes how we do measure it. We look at the size of the home, the model, and the year, make, model of the car, the watch on your wrist. You know, there's a watch brand called Philippe Patek or something like that. And they have watches that cost millions of dollars. Millions of dollars. I was guilty when I bought this. I felt like, man, that's too much money, you know. $600 for a watch? Are you crazy? You know? But then, so if you see a man wearing a watch that costs more than your home, well, that's a successful man. But does he think he's successful? You know, Solomon was a success as the world would have seen it. But he wasn't a success to God because God says, you're losing this kingdom, boy. Because of you, I'm taking this. I'm not going to take Judah from your daddy because of your daddy. So sometimes it does help who your daddy is. But if it had been anybody else, he would have taken it all away. And that one man caused the division of that kingdom, and it fell apart. And he, the great king, he started it. And so he's asking this question, you know, I have success. And he tells us that too, success in and of itself, stuff, accomplishments, even in and of themselves, that doesn't answer the question. That's not enough. There is no meaning and purpose in just success for its sake. He couldn't find it. Couldn't find it. Then he gets into the futility of hard labor. He said, then I turned to all the work that my hands had designed and all the labor that I had toiled to make. And notice, all of it was vanity and chasing the wind, and there was no benefit under the sun. How do we view work? I think of work as a blessing to me. My job's sometimes very stressful, but I do enjoy what I do, and I love the fact that I have something that, you know, to occupy my time. Because this thing right here, you know, I go to bed very early because if I don't go to bed very early, I will think myself into a corner and just do, you know, so I have to, I need to be busy because I just, So I go to bed very early so I can get up early and get to work. And so for me, work is a blessing. It's something that I provide for my needs, but also in my work, I do get to help people. So that's I like that, you know. But some people look at work maybe as a curse because that's what God told. You know, here's the thing. God told Adam and Eve before they sinned, he put them in this beautiful, perfect garden. They had a perfect relationship with him and said, you can eat whatever you want, but you're going to have to keep the garden. So work was part of creation from the beginning. But when he sinned, he said, now by the sweat of your brow, you're going to have to earn your living. And now you're going to have to deal with thorns and thistles and weeds and blight and bugs and all these other things. So sometimes one of the remnants of this curse is the stress we have in our jobs and the fact that, you know, it's like sand and grit on sandpaper to, you know, I think sometimes God's sense of humor is pretty good because he puts us in situations that he knows we're uncomfortable and we gripe and we kick and we scream, but he knows he's got us there because he's wanting to take that situation and use it as sandpaper in our lives. But oftentimes some people look at work as like, well, I shouldn't have to do this, you know. But it's God's plan from the beginning. But working in and of itself, in Solomon's eyes, that too is vain. If that's your meaning, if that's your purpose, if anything in and of itself that's in the wrong spot will leave you high and dry. You know, family, children, your job, your money, your stuff, your pleasure, all that. If it's in the wrong spot, will leave you high and dry. I met a guy, an Ethiopian fellow, 20 years ago. His name was Mulugeta. I'll never forget him. He grew up in Ethiopia, and he had survived the famine. If you remember those days, I think maybe back in the 80s, because he was a little bit older than me, and I was born in 68. But anyway, I met him. I took him out to eat. I can't remember how we met. I just remember I took him out to dinner, and my wife and I, and we took him out, and we were just trying to get to know him. And he said something interesting. This is a guy who had no food as a child, and, some of his family perished. But I asked him, because I was trying to, talk to the gospel with him, and he wanted to hear about it. So I said, well, you come, and I'll take you out to eat, and we'll talk about Jesus. And he just was hard and resistant. And I said, well, if Jesus isn't your God, who is your God? And here's what he said: work. Work. He says, you say your God provides for you. Guess who provides for me? Work. And he just had a hardness about him because, everything he ever got, he worked hard for it. And in some way that made sense to him. Work. That's who I worship, And I just never forget that. And a younger person back in those days, it just seemed strange to me. But now, as I've gotten older, I kind of get it from his standpoint, from somebody who woke up in the morning and there's no food anywhere in your village. There's no food anywhere, and you're trying to find a way to survive, And all that it wasn't anything. It was the government, It was the government. And so he could trust one thing in his mind, and that was his work. So Solomon, he gives us three choices tonight in chapter 2 to deal with looking for meaning, looking for purpose, looking for the answer, what profit is there under the sun. And at the end of this chapter, he's still got the same tune. All is vanity, it's all futile, nothing makes sense, right? But he does come up with this. And the final point he says is just be content. And here's how he puts contentment. He says there's nothing better for a man to do than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in his labor. And labor in that sense is all those activities: pleasure, success, hard work, whatever, and all that labor under the sun. And the job of living, let's say it living, and the man should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his life. Just be content. Paul said, I have learned whatever state I'm in to be content. And there's a proverb, I'm probably going to misquote it, but it says, if a little is not enough, then much is never enough, And so he gets to the end of chapter 2 and he comes up with this: just be content with what you got, where you got, stay in your lane. That's kind of the way we say it nowadays. Just be happy with what you have. And that's a good tip. I mean, I would say that for everybody. How many of you heard my mother told me all the time, I think she told me Sunday, son, don't wish your life away. Don't wish your life away. I said, I'm not wishing my life away. I'm just wishing 2 weeks of it. I'm tired. Just 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks away, and then I'll get myself breaking this. But being content, being content. And I wish every one of you tonight, I hope you're content with who you serve. If you get that down right, everything else is going to matter. But if Jesus isn't in the right place, I said last week, life is vain without Christ. I learned that as an atheist, and just trying to encourage my children, because, who am I to think that just because, I raised them in church like my mama raised me in church, that they're not going to make the same mistakes I made. That's every one of our fears as parents. So you try to encourage them. And I've just told them, I said, if you have a question about anything, you ask me, because I've done it and I've said it and I've been through it. And, trust me, I've come to the conclusion, and I'm not the smartest man in the world, but I've asked questions, I've looked under rocks, and Jesus is real. And he is the truth, and he is the life, and the word of God is true. I can tell you that with 1,000% yes. And so I hope that my children take me up on that. But I also know that their children, and well, they're not now, they're all much older, but they're going to have to bang up their own shins. And I just pray that God keeps his hands on them. So let's bring this thing to a conclusion. I hope somebody has a comment or a question. So Solomon searched for meanings and purpose and profit for man, to the point that he's found nothing in and of itself that has any purpose or any profit, and he just doesn't find meaning in it. Many people have set out to divine their own answer. That's what existentialism means. You determine what meaning is. You determine your purpose. But there's something hollow in that if we don't know the one who created us, because he did create us for a purpose. And it's a part of our responsibility to discover it. But I said last week that Jesus is the cheat code, and he has the answer. Last week we saw nothing crooked could be made straight. God says, behold, all the crooked things shall be made straight. God said it. He didn't say might be or maybe. He said shall be made straight. There's nothing new under the sun. God said, behold, I do something new. And so tonight, I think Jesus' answer to chapter 2, as New Testament people, the key for us, and Solomon didn't know this, is aligning ourselves in the right relationship with God, being on the right side of God. And to be on the right side of God, we have to come through Jesus Christ. And he is the key. And here's what Jesus said about all these things. Searching for purpose, searching for meaning, searching for what life's all about. One answer Jesus gives is this: he who seeks to save his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. So if Jesus isn't part of your equation, that's why you're always getting the wrong answer. It's like leaving out the variable in algebra. If you don't have the variable right, if you don't figure out what X means, then the answer's wrong. Well, the variable in our equation, it starts with Jesus Christ, because he's the reason we're alive. My children are not the reason I'm alive. They're part of it. My calling was not the reason that I'm alive. It's part of it. Anything I do is not the reason I'm alive. It's part of it. The reason I'm alive, we talked about last week, is this: to get to know God more and more and more and more, and become more like him more and more. Jesus is the reason we're alive. God created us for his pleasure and purpose. And when we come into the place where we can please God, that's when life will make sense. How do I know I'm pleasing it? You'll know. We know we're pleasing God when we have faith. We know we're pleasing God when we're doing what he asks us to do. We know we're pleasing God when we are seeking his face, where we're active in the walk. And so that's the reason Solomon everything was vain to him. He got on the wrong side of God, and he was out there trying to do this on his own. I don't care how smart you are, bub. You don't have the right answer because your equation's messed up. Jesus, if you try to save your life, and that's what he's trying to do. What's this all for? Can I tell you the greatest, and please don't take this wrong, and I'm not trying to, if we're not careful, our life is our greatest idol. In the back of the book, Jesus said, they didn't love their lives more than me. Wow. Solomon loved his life. Now, Jesus don't want you to kill yourself. No, that's not what he's talking about. But if we're not careful, even life itself in the wrong place is wrong. One of the books we read in English 3, or one of the stories, is The Crucible. That play about the Salem witch trials. And at the end of the play, it ends with John Proctor going to the gallows instead of lying. He'd rather hang than lie and say, I'm a witch. We have to wrestle with these things. But Jesus is the answer. And Jesus has another answer about death itself. Here's why Jesus is not, This is why Jesus went to the cross. He said, for he who believes in me will never die. John 11:26. So what Solomon said about death isn't 100% true. Because if you're a foolish person and you deny God in Christ and you die outside of him, guess what? Death isn't the same for him as it is for the wise person who builds his house upon the rock of Christ Jesus. It's two different deaths. Jesus didn't say something that was a lie. You believe in me, you never die. Oh, this body, yeah. Yeah, body might, but the soul and the person, no. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So that's why it's not that bad. That's why I can read Ecclesiastes nowadays and it don't take me into a pit, because I found the answer. I got the right variable. I found Jesus, or Jesus found me. So that's the whole point of this whole book. In every chapter, in every place where Solomon goes south, Jesus takes us back north and says, oh, but wait. But wait. Sometimes we might get a little uncomfortable with saying these things. And I'm like, Solomon, he has a book in the Bible, yeah. But let's look at it through the New Testament. Anybody have a comment or a thought or a question about anything we've read so far in Ecclesiastes? Thank you guys for being here. Remember, if you want to go back and look at it, it'll be online next Monday.